Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you send out dozens of different job applications to different companies, maybe even different industries, but you receive barely any invitations for a job interview? And you wonder, is it maybe my CV? Is the labor market just really tough? Or do I have wrong experience or not enough experience? Then this video is really for you. We're going to dive into how to optimize and tailor your CV to increase your chances of getting an interview invite. Because in my experience, a lot of the times when people send out dozens or maybe even hundreds of applications unsuccessfully, then their CV plays a really big role into them not getting an invite for an interview. So how do we actually write a CV that really increases our chances to get an invite for an interview? We're going to structure this into two parts. One where we're going through the structure of a good CV, and then also through the content of what really makes a good CV. And I'm going to show you an example CV that I found on the internet. It's just a hopefully a non-existing person. And we're going to really, on that CV, go through what is done right, what is done wrong, and what could you do to really bring the CV to the next level. Let's start with the structure before we dive into that example CV. A good CV usually has 4 to maximum 5 different sections, and they're predefined and they don't really vary by job or industry. So I'm just going to name them to you, and I'm going to name them to you in the right sequence already. So on the top of your CV, you have your work experience. That's quite self-explanatory, right? Then afterwards, you have your university education. And the third section is going to be any awards or scholarships or special programs that you've participated in to really make you stand out from anyone else that just studied, for example, let's pick mechanical engineering, right? And the fourth point is your extracurriculars. So those are things that you do outside of your university or your job that have some relevance, right? So for example, that should be ideally voluntary work or anything that you do that has some meaningful contribution to society. And that could be, for example, you're working in an animal shelter or you're engaging in a political party. So those kind of things are listed in the extracurricular section. And the fifth section, that really depends on the job, is if you have any other skills that are not directly related to university education or to your job description. That could be, for example, if you're a programmer, certain programming languages, or if you're applying for a job where spoken languages could be relevant, then that's your skills in English or Russian or Spanish or whatever, right? So any skills that are not immediately related to your university and to your work. And that's it. It's really just those 4 to 5 sections in your CV. Nothing else, nothing less than that. And also not in any fancy design or layout. It's really just table format, white page with those 4 to 5 sections, right? Anything else can maybe be, if you're applying for a creative job, can be helpful if you have a creative or special design, but for anything else, a non-white simple table design is simply just going to make your chances to receiving that job slimmer, right? It's not going to help, it's just going to make the chances slimmer or not going to have any effect at all. So that's why I recommend a very simple table format layout. I often get asked, how long should that CV actually be? And I found that recruiters really vary in their answer when you ask them that question. So there's not really a true answer, should be definitely 1 page, it should be definitely 2 pages. It really depends on your work experience and with what you fill that. If you're fresh out of university and you start to apply for your first job, then definitely 1 page is sufficient, and anything more than 1 page actually is too much. You're just going to make the recruiter not really read through it, because if we're being honest, if you just went to university before, maybe you've done some voluntary work, then what are you going to fill 2 pages with, right? But if you're applying for a more senior position, you've already had a couple of different jobs, maybe different functions already, potentially also worked in different countries, then it could make sense to make that CV a bit longer, 2 pages, right? Depending on really how rich your experience is, and if you want to really tailor and show that experience to that specific job that you're applying to, right? But then it really needs to be also specific and not just nonsense bullet or just some keywords that you put in there and they don't really mean anything, right? So if you make it longer, make sure that there is really reasonable and actionable content in there. If you have really a lot of experience, you're applying for C-level positions, C-1 positions, maybe it can be longer than 2 pages, but for most of us, that's not really relevant, right? So try to really, if you have some experience and you can't really fit it to 1 page, try to really maximum end up at 2 pages and not more than that. And I'm going to give you a few advices or pieces of advice in a second on how we actually manage to shorten it, because a lot of the CVs that I see where people tell me, oh Simon, I have no idea how I can cut that down to 1 page or to 2 pages, and in the end we go through it and you can literally halve it, right? Because there are a couple of tricks where you can really save some space or shorten things and then it really fits on 1 or 2 pages. Before we dive into that, let's look at the actual example CV that we're going to deep dive into together to really discuss the structure and also the content points of the CV. So this is a CV I found on the internet. I don't think it's real, but it highlights what I see a lot when people are showing me the CV, that they bring this kind of format or design or this kind of content structure, right? So the first thing you see here, this is not really a table format blank white design. I mentioned before, that's just really hurting your application, because if we look at what's really on focus here in this page is the left section, right? This is blue and in focus. The first thing you look at when you look at this CV is the left hand side. And what's really in there is contact, is name, is job title, which should be quite obvious, and the languages and hobbies that he has, right? The only thing that's really relevant to the application that's on this focus left hand side is the skills, right? His programming skills. That's the only thing meaningful on the left hand side. What's actually really meaningful is his work experience, and that's in the non-highlighted right section. So it's really not helping you to have such a design, especially if it's then focusing on the wrong things. So I would recommend you first thing, go to a simple table format and don't do any fancy layout designs, and make sure that if you do, then at least highlight the important things in the colored section, right? So that's the first point. How do you then also shorten things? There's, for example, a lot of space on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of that CV. And there it's okay-ish. I've seen CVs where it's even worse, where there's plenty of space on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, which you can just fill by stretching it out, right? So just making the lines wider. That saves a lot of space already. Also, and he's been doing that good here, is to use bullets. Never use full text in a CV. And when you use bullets, I would recommend you to format them in a consistent manner. So the sentence structure should be consistent across all the bullets. What do I mean by that? So for example here, he's doing it quite well with a few minor mistakes. So for example, in most of his bullets, the verb is coming in the first part of the bullet, right? Developed or led, developed, worked. And that really makes it easy to skim through the bullets because your brain doesn't have to think it's the same sentence structure all over again. You made a minor mistake here by, first of all, it's a spelling mistake, but also you put it in the present tense and the other ones are past. So just make sure that you format your bullets according to the same structure, and you also don't make any spelling mistakes, of course. But I do like that he has those bullet formats and he's not really putting on full text. He does have a full text here at the beginning. I don't really see the point, because there's nothing in this text, if you read it, that's going to give your interviewer a better chance at understanding of who you are and what skills you bring to the table. It's very generic. That's something we're going to dive in a bit later in the content section. But overall, in the structure part, I would mostly not recommend writing a profile introduction. If you do, it really needs to be something that makes you stand out, that's unique, and that you don't find anywhere else in the CV. So don't use any high-level phrases that don't really say anything. Then just leave it out, and you have a lot more space to put other information in there. What I do like is that he's not overusing bolding and italics and underlining. I've seen some CVs where people have all three formatings and they just overuse it. And the point of that is to really make sections clear and distinguish them from each other and make it easy to read. And if you overdo it and you underline stuff, you bold it, then you make it italic, it's just going to look chaotic. So I really like that it's simple, he's bolding his positions, but he's not really using too much of underlining or cursive or italic format. So that's really good, it looks clean, right? What I would recommend in general, if you have a table format, then I would recommend you to make the date section also as small as possible, so you have really a wide space for the text. That's another good tip to save some space. He's doing that quite well, actually. The date section is not too big here. What I don't particularly like is that he broke his own design or layout in the education section, where he puts the date under the actual title. So I don't really like that so much, so please stay in the same format and not to switch it between the different sections. So let's move on to the content of the CV, second part, right? In general, I would recommend you to write a very comprehensive CV as a template that you're then going to tailor for each specific job application. So you have one template that you're going to open every time when there's a new job coming up that you want to apply for, and then you just shorten sections that you don't need and add some other elements that you maybe need for this specific job, and that really helps you to save time. And it also makes sure that you have certain keywords and phrases that they, for example, have in the job description in your CV. So you really tailor it. And not only the keywords, but that you also highlight the experience that you have that is relating to the job in each application. That's really key, because especially with the keywords, a lot of larger companies, they automatically screen those CVs. And if there's no keyword in there, or just not enough, or you're not showing the skills that they're looking for, then your CV is not even going to be reviewed by a real HR person. So make sure that you tailor the CV to the job description by including keywords, highlighting your experiences, and also your skills that relate to that job. That's the first part. I would also even go one step further to even adjust your language to the job and industry that you're applying for. So for example, when I applied to McKinsey, I used a different language in my CV as when I was applying for a technical position, right? It's simply a different jargon. I want to make sure you don't misunderstand that or overshoot. Don't blast your CV with some industry phrases that don't really fit into the context and don't really have any meaning in that way that you use it, or it's just too much and it feels like unnatural, right? They should have the impression that you know about the industry, you know about that job, you have experience in it, and that way you just naturally understand this kind of phrases, that jargon, but it's not that you are pushing it to really artificially bring into that CV. So try to find a sweet spot by using language but not overdoing it. The next point is related to that, and that is to focus. Really don't include any information that's not going to help you to get that specific job, right? And it's going to be difficult, right? You're going to read through your CV and you think, well, all of this is actually interesting, right? All of this really makes me as a person and as a professional and maybe can be helpful for the job, but in reality, the interviewer is really looking for a certain set of skills and characteristics of you as a person that he's going to decide based on, is this candidate right or not right for my job? And the more of fluff and other stuff and experience you put in there that don't really matter to him, the more difficult for him is it going to actually find those things that do matter to him. Maybe he's just skimming through it and he doesn't see it immediately and just tossed aside, right? That could be a reason, if you were sending a lot of applications but you're not getting a lot of interview invitations, that you simply don't focus. So I really recommend you focus on what's really key to the position you're applying to and delete everything else. And what is relevant or in focus can also even vary over time and change over time. I'm going to give you an example. So if you're fresh out of university, then by all means include your internships that you did during your university time, unless it's just some 2-week short-term internship that didn't really have any implications for the job that you're applying to, right? But then if you're on the other hand already working for 5 years, maybe in different companies, maybe different positions and functions even, then it's maybe time to cut out some internship experiences, right? If there's one that really fits to the job, keep it in, but you don't really need to list if you've done 3-4 different internships during your uni time that don't really matter to the job that you're doing in 5 years after that, right? So really just focus on those core elements. And the same thing when you describe your university degrees. So I would recommend everyone, for example, especially if it's relevant to the job, to write out the topic of your thesis. And maybe even some specialization or focus that you took in your degree, especially if it's fitting to the job. And then on the other side, if you're already in the job for 10 years, it's really not that relevant anymore what the name and the grade of your thesis was, unless it's really specific to the exact position that you're applying to, right? One last comment on the university section. I sometimes see people not adding grades, and I would always recommend you to do that. So add your grade, and if you've been at a very competitive university where, for example, you have just a grade of B, I'm just going to name the letter B because in different countries you can have different grading systems, but let's say it's like good but not really that good, but it's really competitive universities, and with your B you're in the top 5%, right? Then write that, right? You have a grade B and in brackets top 5% of my class. That really helps the interviewer to understand, well, is that B going to be comparable to maybe someone's A that went to a completely different university? So I'd recommend you doing that And also if your degree of your bachelor or master thesis is significantly better than your overall GPA, then add that grade on top extra next to the title of your bachelor or master degree, because it shows then that in that specific thesis you really performed or outperformed. And for the next point, let's have a look again at this example CV that I showed you before. And this point is really key, so make sure that you consider this one in your CV when you're writing it. Let's take a look at his work experience. When he's describing his work experience, let's look at the first point. He's writing, developed and maintained software using Java, Python and C++. So what does that really tell you? Imagine you're the interviewer, you're reading that CV, what do you learn from that? Essentially, the only thing you learn is that he can use Java, Python and C++. Well, you already know that if you just look at the skills section on the left-hand side of the CV. So that's telling you nothing new. And if you're an interviewer, what you're trying to understand is, one, does the person have the skills and the experience, the work experience references that I'm really needing for my specific project? And two, does he understand how to create value for the company? And well, how do you demonstrate that? By really highlighting what was your specific contribution in that project. What did you do? Not the team, what was the project about? What did really you specifically do? And try to quantify that as much as possible, because that really helps the interviewer to understand what experience do you have. And then second, what value creation was the result of that? Right? So for example, you have worked on the development of a certain product feature, and that was the workstream that you were responsible for, and that in the end reduced the cost of the product by 20%, which saved the company 10 million per year, just making it up, right? If you write it like that, there's a huge difference to what is written here, because the reader, the interviewer, understands what exactly you did. You worked on that specific product development or arm of the product, and of course specify and quantify it. I'm just giving you a short example. And you also understand what he's really paying attention to. It's value creation. So he sees that, yes, this guy is getting it. You're hiring, if you're the interviewer for a moment, you're hiring a guy to create the maximum value for your company. And if you can really showcase that in your CV, that you've created value in different positions, maybe even different companies, then you are showing that you are the right guy for the job. You can bring value to the new company, new position as well. And that's really, really, really key. One more thing about the education or awards section. If you're an engineer or a scientist, and especially if you've done a PhD and you've published some papers, maybe patents, you've presented in conferences, then that's something that can really put you apart from other people, right? Especially if these papers or patents are specifically about the topic that you're going to work on in the job that you're applying for, right? However, I wouldn't list all your papers and cite them in your CV. What I would do is just put in a link or the name of your ResearchGate profile or any profile where they can read the references to your papers, and just name that you've published, for example, 7 papers, 1 patent, you presented at 3 international conferences. That's it in your education section when you did your PhD or your master, and don't really go into too much more detail and just reference ResearchGate or any other site where they can check that. If you're a consultant, a management consultant, or you work in PE or banking, then one more advice here, confidentiality is really a big, big point, right? So I've told you to quantify your achievements and also what impact it had on the company, but really make sure you're not sharing any confidential information or information about the company or anything that could help the interviewer identify which company you're talking about, right? Because then the interviewer is going to read that and think, oh, this guy is just sharing confidential stuff. When he leaves my company, if I give him a job now, he's also going to share all of my confidential stuff. That's really negative, right? So if you're a consultant, try to make sure you're not breaking any confidentiality agreements that you had during your consulting time or banking time or PE time. One last thing, and that's really valid for anyone, about the voluntary section. It's in general always positive if you put in things that you've worked on that contribute in some form to society, if it's some voluntary work, right? However, be very careful to not put in things that can be very polarizing. I'll give you an example. If you are an activist for the left party, I would probably not put that in there. I mean, maybe you believe that that's a good thing, and I'm not here to get political or to judge. Maybe it is, but there are a lot of people who will certainly think it's not, right? And then if they read that and you've maybe got an interview who doesn't really like it, then they're going to actually already give you a disadvantage, even if it's subconscious, even if they're not really doing it consciously, but they're going to think, oh, this is probably not the right candidate. So include anything that you have done voluntarily or some contribution to society, but just make sure you leave out everything that's on a spectrum very far out where people might get offended or they might not like it, right? And just leave those things out. That's it for today. Thanks a lot for watching. In our one-on-one coaching calls, we're actually going to look at my personal CV with which I applied to McKinsey and also for my current Vice President of Technology position in the energy industry. And we're going to look at how all those points that I just mentioned are reflected there. And then, of course, we're also going to dive into your CV and going to dissect it and really make sure you're fulfilling all those points as well. And you're matching it to the industry and job that you're actually going to apply for to really maximize your chances to get an interview invitation. And also, when I mentioned the interview, make sure that you watch those videos that I've uploaded on how to interview. I've uploaded 3 videos that really help you to interview both on a technical basis, so technical interview questions, but also really help you how to structure and answer any questions around your social skills or soft skills. That's really key, so make sure you watch them as well. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.